I read these two books together, actually more or less by happenstance. But when I read them together, it very strongly struck me that they belonged on the same bookshelf, because what both books were a comparison of an unsatisfactory present, one for the Republican and Democratic Party, against a better past. In your case, a much more, as you say, legislative Democratic Party. In Henry Olson's case, a view of Ronald Reagan, especially the pre-presidential Ronald Reagan, who spoke very much in concrete terms and very, very much about the impact of what government did, and the federal government especially did, on the pay packages and living standards of very ordinary people with whom Ronald Reagan always identified. And what I worry about is that this country is changing faster than its politics are, and I think one of the ways to think about this is how stable so much of American politics is. If you look back over the past 20 years, if Rip Van Winkle were to fall asleep in 1990 and wake up in 2015 and say, who are the leading candidates for president? Bush and Clinton. What are they talking about? Well, healthcare in Iraq. Now, imagine that time traveler stepping in that machine, having the backward experience, going back 25 years to 1965, which is the same distance from 1990 as 2015. The whole world's different. The cities are on fire. There are liberal Republicans. The two most important people in Washington, D.C. are the head of the AFL-CIO and J. Edgar Hoover. It's just an unimaginably different world. The United States, and I think many of us who are older, I don't think we've absorbed the magnitude of the social changes that have happened just over the past 15 years. The impact of immigration, the impact on middle-class living standards, the crisis of health that has happened to middle-class Americans. The United States has decreasing lifespans for baby boomers. That did not happen during the Great Depression. The only case in a developed country not in a state of war where life expectancy goes down is in the post-Soviet states. Mm-hmm. The United States is having a post-Soviet. Now, none of us are. I mean, we're all doing great. And we're going to live for a long time, and we have very stable lives. And I mean, every day there's some new amazing flavor at Starbucks. But
speak for yourself.
But in New York, they turn up their noses at Starbucks. But here in real America, where we drive, and this is the world that produced even the possibility of a Trump presidency. I mean, if you're electing Donald Trump for president, you're obviously not thinking about how do I get things passed that I really want to get passed, and that make imaginable, rather than laughable, an Oprah candidacy. I mean, I don't think that's going to happen, but that may just be my own conservatism at work. The United States, I think we idealize the way politics was done in the 30 years after World War II. Thank you for mentioning my history of the 70s. The big argument of that book is that the experience of those years of the middle part of the 19th century is the most aberrant period in American history. And it's an experience formed by something that America had not had through most of its life, which is hypermobilization for war. Two wars and a Great Depression, which forced standardization. The United States had conscription. It had a level of federal intervention in the economy. It had a level of equality, a movement toward equality that it had never seen before. And that what happened as the era of mass mobilization for big wars ended was the United States went back to being what it was in the 19th century, a much more vociferous society, where people had much less in common with one another. So that what Mark is describing and deploring, and what Henry Olson is describing and regretting, is in many ways the politics of the country catching up to the sociology of the country. Mm-hmm. I do, but I think you can put them both together, because I think in those years between 1917 and 1975, when we made the America that for most of us is the America of our imaginations, the America which most of us grew up, that America had as one of its foundational myths a story about what had happened in the age of mass migration from 1880 to 1920 that was largely an after-the-fact romanticization. I'll give you an anecdote that sort of sums up how it seemed at the time. Study the First World War. One of the mysteries of the First World War is how unbelievably provocative the Kaiser's Germany was toward the United States. In retrospect, it seems insane, the things they did. They really pushed the United States to a point where it had no ability to go to war, had no opportunity to war. So the man who was the U.S. ambassador in Germany during this period wrote an autobiography or a memoir of his period. And it's a period I'm very interested in, so I read it. And he tells this story that he would go and reproach Zimmerman, he of the famous telegram that proposed a Mexican invasion of the United States, another, how could they have thought of such a crazy thing, idea, to complain about one or another outrage. And Zimmerman said to him, we're not worried about you. The United States has no capacity to make war. You're not an organized society of any kind. In fact, there are 500,000 veterans of the Kaiser's army living in your country. And if you tried to go to war with us, you would find yourself with a military uprising in your own country. And the ambassador gave a reply that he quotes in his book that was once very famous. Now you can see when I give the reply why it's forgotten. He said there may be 500,000 veterans of the Kaiser's army living in the United States, but there are 500,001 lampposts. Okay, but the level of repression brought to bear against the German minority in those years was unbelievable. I mean, the things that we heard about after 9/11, when there were, I think, there's some incidents, there's some bullying, there are 3 hate crime homicides. What happened in those, and the United States before the First World War had the bloodiest labor relations anywhere on the planet, by far, by orders of magnitude, almost always on ethnic lines, where the people on one side who would be deploying the force would be of one ethnicity, and the striking laborers who would be subjected to violence would be of another. And of course, and the United States, of course, had, a campaign of incredible violence of white against black through the South. And immediately after the First World War, a level of violence in the cities to which many blacks had moved that looks like nothing so much as pogroms. I mean, it actually, and the level of violence that you saw in the United States in 1919, again, was greater than the level of violence you saw in war-torn Germany by the Freikorps against ethnic minorities and communists. The numbers of people were killed, in the biggest riots in Oklahoma City, hundreds and hundreds of people. Probably the toll in all of Germany in the Spartacist uprisings was less than the toll in just that one urban riot. When you say, what was it, how do we think about it? I think how we think about it reflects how it was, and how it was reflects how we think about it. The politics of the American South, from the coming of any offer of black suffrage after the Civil War, are politics of white against black. But the politics of the northern United States were a politics in which the category of white did not exist until very recently. Italian immigrants competed with Irish immigrants, sometimes very violently through organized gangs. Protestants, Catholics, that's the driver of Massachusetts politics. I mean, when Henry Cabot Lodge faced against John F. Kennedy, they were not talking about tax rates. There's a line in one of Philip Roth's short stories where a boy comes home with a black eye, and his mother asks what happens, and he says, I was beaten up on the way home by the Catholics. And the narrator explains he used the term Catholics in the broad sense to include Protestants, but of course, that's a very Jewish joke. That begins to change with the large-scale migration of blacks from the South into the cities of the North, beginning during the First World War, accelerating during World War II, and really accelerating in the 15 years after World War II. So a lot of people who hated each other before World War II discovered that maybe they were moving to the same suburbs, they were intermarrying, there was a lot written about this time in public interest in all the magazines we grew up with and that Mark edited. These identities began to blur. They lost their distinctiveness, also in the confrontation with blacks versus whites, but it still was not that it would have seemed weird. In 1980, to talk about white politics marked you as a person of the left. No one thought that way if you weren't on the left, because these other inherited identities seemed Reagan's big success was his big breakthrough with Catholics. That's what it meant to be a Reagan Democrat. You were a Catholic, and you had voted Democrat, and now you're voting Republican, and that was a big event. That has changed. Immigration has changed. We are now seeing the birth of a white identity, and not just in the United States, but across the developed world. That what you're seeing, that the old parties of right and left, which used to be divided by their attitudes toward capital versus labor, by their attitude between state sector and private. The party of the left was the party of labor, and especially the party of labor in the state sector. The party of the right was the party of professionals, managers, owners, and especially people who worked in the private sector. That just doesn't describe politics at all anymore in Western Europe. There's a party that is rooted in people whose grandparents lived in the country, and there's a party that is rooted in people whose grandparents did not live in the country. And though they have not completely forgotten those older definitions of why you're a conservative, why labor, why you're a Gaullist, why you're a socialist, why Christian Democrat, why social democrat, increasingly this new kind of politics is coming to the fore, and we see that happening in the United States. One of the things that I think is I talk about this a little bit in my book, one of the things that is really remarkable is you hear a lot of talk about how liberal millennials are. If you, that is interpreting a demographic change as a generational change. If you look at white males under 30, they are not liberal. They're not liberal at all. And in fact, Romney did extremely well among white males under 30. He did not so well with white women, but it's better than you might think. And Trump did very well with white males under 30. And when you do these sort of deeper probes about do they feel they're getting a fair deal, and this is maybe the thing you report on your campus events. I mean, one of the things that is one of the drivers of this change is we have you hear it in a lot of places that these young men under 30 are told, because you're white and male and under 30, you're a person of privilege. Mm-hmm. They're saying, well, how come I'm living 5 years less long than my grandfather did? I don't feel privileged. I feel persecuted. I feel oppressed, and I feel lied to. And that is exactly how you get social convulsions. Revolutions are made by downwardly mobile elites. America has a lot of downwardly mobile elites. When you ask this question, this is where we really miss Henry, because he would explain to us how this affects sheriffs' races. Henry, one of his, I don't think he does this to be funny, but he will periodically call. There'll be some election in Saskatchewan. I'm originally from Canada that I'm not paying a lot of attention to, and he will ask, why did Red River go the way it did? and then you have to do a certain amount of and that. You don't want to say, how did it go? Because then, you have to, you look for clues. The point is when I wrote an article about this just after the 2008 election, because I was interested in this subject and looked at a number of districts where this had happened. Now, to some degree, what is going on is simply coincidence. It's just, or it's something where the thing you're seeing has its own cause. So I spent some time in St. Louis and noticed that St. Louis County, which is where the district Richard Gephardt used to represent, was trending Republican, where St. Louis City, which was having a lot of gentrification, or, by Midwestern standards, a lot of gentrification. It wasn't San Francisco, but it was happening. It was becoming more and more Democrat. So what wasn't that there was one kind of person who was moving up into St. Louis City. It was that St. Louis City both had a heavily minority, heavily black population that voted Democrat for one set of reasons, and it also had amenities and housing stock of a kind that were attractive to people who arrived and voted Democrat for completely different reasons. And the effect of this was not, although you got a 100% or a very liberal Democrat, you also then had insanely bitter factional politics within the Democratic Party, because these people didn't have a lot in common. What was more striking, what was happening on the Republican side of the line, on the Republicanizing side of the line, this was an inner suburb with a lot of houses from of the period around World War II, smaller houses, and these are people who would have once been upper working class people, aerospace, people doing well in the brewery industry, and now they were sort of the the frayed white collar middle class. So here, I think, is one way to explain, I think, what is going on here.